Chapter 13. Pain Unlearned. "Come on, you can do it," Sandra said. I was lying on my stomach on the therapeutic table. My legs were stretched out, and I was being told to raise my lower leg up to a 90-degree knee bend. "You can do it," she kept encouraging me. But as much as I tried, I just couldn't get my leg up. Not even a centimeter. "We will have to do quite a bit of work on you," Sandra said. Originally from the north of Sweden, Sandra was a small young woman and a good therapist who knew what she was doing. She methodically went through each of my muscles to see how much control I still had over them. Since my stroke, I had lost a lot of muscle mass in my left arm, shoulder, and leg. Although I had learned to walk again, I could still only walk with a brace and a cane, and my walking didn't look anywhere near perfect. Most of the therapists at Klimendal seemed to concentrate their efforts on speed, not proper movement. They regularly timed my walk with the stopwatch and with their mantra of "the faster the better." I soon noticed that there was almost no focus on how I walked. Treatment in clinics seemed to be primarily gauged by measurable improvements. I also considered it strange that the patient's age seemed to carry no weight whatsoever on how the treatment plan was structured. The Klimendal file said, "Linda walks the block in 7 minutes and 21 seconds. To them, this indicated an improvement of more than 1 minute compared to 3 weeks earlier. They interpreted those numbers as evidence that I was making progress with my therapy, as if it didn't matter how I walked. In contrast, at rehab station, more focus was put on my muscle control. Training the muscles would improve control over them, so Sandra taught me to exercise my weakened muscle as much as possible. I continued to practice the exercises with Sandra every morning, working out hamstrings, the back of my left buttocks, my front lower leg, my left foot, and many other muscles that I didn't have sufficient control over. I had not used those enough over the past few months, so they had shrunk considerably. The movement of my knee exacerbated the shrunken muscle tissue, since my left knee would overbend. I was also dealing with the left foot that would not extend, lift up, called drop foot. At Klimendal, they continued to assert that they weren't sure if I would ever be able to get rid of the brace that kept my foot somewhat extended at all times. I chose to ignore that negativity and be a little more optimistic. I had regained some control over my left large toe and thought to myself, that's a start at least. Reading about neuroplasticity had convinced me that if I exercised every day, my brain would slowly increase its control over the damaged area again. I was similarly optimistic about my arm and shoulder. My arm had remained in an awkward position since my stroke, bent over my stomach with my hand rigid and cramped. The levels of pain I mentioned before had become my main problem and begun to obstruct my recovery. Every day around 4 p.m., the pain became unbearable. At rehab station, they made an appointment for me with their pain doctor too. He suggested spreading out the time when I took the pain medication, instead of taking it all at night. I was hesitant because I was already dealing with the drug's side effects, and spreading out the hours of intake might cause me to have that unfocused and hazy feeling more often throughout the day. There has to be another way, was my only thought. There was. I had been reading about a man named Moskowitz in The Brain's Way of Healing. Deutsch begins by explaining a bit of Moskowitz's background. Michael Moskowitz, MD, is a psychiatrist who turned himself into a pain specialist and set up a pain clinic in partnership with a friend. Bay Area Medical Associates, BAMA, in California was set up as a place where people with chronic pain could be treated. The people who seek out this clinic typically have tried all available painkillers and drugs, including nerve blockers, general injections, acupuncture, and other potential options for easing their pain. When those patients arrive at BAMA, all mainstream and alternative treatments have usually failed them. As Moskowitz states in Deutsch's book, everything that can be done for you has been done for you. They come here to die with their pain. In Deutsch's book, I read all about chronic pain. It is important to realize how pain works. The central nervous system consists of the brain and spinal cord. When the body encounters an injury, the nervous system transmits a signal through the spinal cord to the brain. The pain center in our brain receives the signal and fires up the cells in the pain mapping areas. Our brain receives a signal as an acute pain says, "This is where you are hurt. Attend to it." The external zones of our body are represented in our brains in specific processing areas called brain maps. Each body part is connected to its own brain map. If the neurons in our brain maps get damaged or reprogrammed after an acute pain, they will continue sending signals. This false alarm makes us believe that the pain is located in our body while it is in fact located in our brain. In the case of neuropathic pain, we are dealing with the negative effects of neuroplasticity. Sure, my pain mapping cells had been damaged as a result of my stroke, but why did my pain extend and get worse? It was as if my brain was reprogramming itself to extend the pain maps. These pain signals are being sent long after the body has healed, so acute pain develops an afterlife, chronic pain. You may have heard the phantom pains occurring in amputated limbs. The pain receptors of that limb are still marked on the brain map. As long as these receptors keep sending pain signals, the brain projects the pain onto missing limb areas, as if it were there. One of the core laws of neuroplasticity is, neurons that fire together, wire together. This can be described as follows. When a child learns the alphabet, the visual shape of the letter A is connected to the sound A. Each time the child looks at the letter and repeats the sound, the neurons involved, auto-visual combination, fire and wire together. If the child repeats this again and again, it makes the word recognizable without having to spell out each individual letter. A good example of how neurons are trained in reading language is an experiment where you are to say the color in which a word is written. It's an easy task, unless you compile a list of words like green in red ink and blue in green ink. Now there is a mismatch between the color and the word, and the task becomes more difficult. Synaptic connections get stronger and circuits get better at performing their task through training. However, the opposite is also true. When a person stops performing an activity for an extended time period, the involved connections are weakened and in most cases lost over time. The expression, use it or lose it, rings true. I thought. The more my left arm keeps hanging there, the more functionality I will lose. If I don't use it, I'll lose it. It all makes so much sense if you think about it. That's how humanity managed to evolve into the technology-loving, creative, and resilient Homo sapiens of our day and age, by constantly evolving higher-order skills and losing body parts we no longer have use for, like a tail. Why did it take so long for science to come up with this? I thought. To defeat my pain, I now had to manipulate the use it or lose it principle to rewire the unwanted brain connections causing my chronic pain. Not an easy task. My pain had increased by then, and I was taking one more amitriptyline pill. I now took 4 or 5 each day, which didn't help. My brain was becoming accustomed to the drug, and it was losing its effect. If I sat down to take a rest, the pain would immediately become worse. The moment I sat down, my pain began to increase dramatically. It seemed as if sitting or lying down triggered my brain's pain maps. I tried to avoid sitting or lying down during the day, but I was eventually forced to sit when exhausted. It seemed like my brain recognized sitting down as a trigger for my pain. The pain slowly spread to neighboring areas, and now it started to descend to my hips. It was a neuroplastic brain trap. I was desperate. If there was a PhD in pain, I would certainly have a shot at it. I realized I had to either be a zombie for the rest of my life or take a new chance on the new Moskowitz endeavor. I took the chance. Moskowitz defines chronic pain as learned pain, when the brain's pain maps are stuck in on mode because the pain receiver has failed to remedy the cause of the acute pain, therefore damaging the central nervous system. How did Moskowitz get rid of his pain? According to Deutsch's book, Moskowitz started by reading around 15,000 pages on neuroscience, basically everything he could find on the subject of neuroplasticity. He learned that we can strengthen circuits between brain areas by getting the involved neurons to fire all together through learning a new skill. He learned that we can strengthen circuits between brain areas by getting the involved neurons to fire all together through learning a new skill. Even more interesting to him was that he discovered that we can also weaken connections since neurons that fire apart. Could he use this concept to weaken the links that shaped his pain maps? He had learned that, according to the use it or lose it principle, the workings of the brain could be described as a constant struggle for cortical real estate. This creates a situation where the brain's most regularly performed activities take up more and more space by essentially stealing the space from other, less regular activities. Moskowitz made a picture of the brain in a state of acute pain by drawing 16 circles in red. Then he created a picture of the brain in a state of chronic pain by drawing 16 large expanding circles in red. He continued by drawing a picture of the brain that did not register any form of pain. Next, he analyzed the 16 areas that fired during episodes of chronic pain. He observed that many of the areas, when they are not processing pain, are used to process sensations, thoughts, images, movement, emotion, visual information, and beliefs. In a chronic pain state, all of those areas are hijacked to process pain. Thinking there may be a way to use competitive plasticity in his favor, Moskowitz wondered if he could redirect those pain processing areas when he was in pain. He proposed the idea of forcing himself to come up with counterstimulation, thus stealing the cells back. This was all based on the ongoing competition for cortical real estate. Since he knew that a considerable part of the brain is dedicated to visual processing, he surmised that the visual activity would make for the best possible counterstimulation. He had been living with constant pain in his neck for over 13 years and was highly motivated to find a solution. Moskowitz consciously imprinted the brain drawing that he had made up in his mind so he could remind himself that the brain is capable of changing. Each time he was in pain, he began by looking at the drawing of chronic pain with the expanding red circles. Then he made himself believe that the pain area was shrinking so that it would eventually look like the drawing of the brain without any pain. "I had to be relentless," he explains, "even more relentless than the pain signal itself." In the first 3 weeks, he did feel a small reduction of pain when visualizing the shrinking pain area. After a month, he got the hang of it and applied the visualization each time he felt a pain spike coming on. His method worked. 6 weeks later, the pain between his shoulders and back disappeared entirely, never to return. After 4 months, he began to experience completely pain-free periods, and within a year, this increased to being quite consistently free of pain. Martin ordered another book for me, Moskowitz's Neuroplastic Transformation Workbook. I read it within a week and then began to implement an adapted form of it. I usually began by looking at the image in the book that contained the large red circles. I'd imagined the pain on my whole left back and neck shrinking a little around the edges. Then I imagined the pain maps in my brain getting slightly smaller too. Next, I continued by looking at the image of the brain without any pain. I even took a picture on my phone of the no pain brain and set it as my phone's screensaver. Each day from 4 to 7 p.m. when my pain was at its worst, I practiced visualizing my pain area getting smaller and smaller for 2 hours straight. I sometimes used a vibrating massage unit on my neck to make my body send additional feedback, a counterattack, to my brain. But nothing happened during the first 8 weeks, and the pain remained the same. When those 8 weeks had passed, however, I began to feel the pain area shrinking slightly. I got the hang of the process too. It was like I entered a flow state during the visualization. I sat there for 2, sometimes 3 hours, but it felt like 20 minutes. I still didn't fully believe it, but the pain area had been slowly receding upward from my hip and a little bit inward and to the left from my spine. During that period, I reduced the amitriptyline from 60 to 50 milligrams. Within a week, though, I felt the pain level rising again. I continued my focus on decreasing the pain area. After 3 months, the pain area was reduced by 60%, and I had also reduced my pain medication to just 20 milligrams of amitriptyline each day. Shortly after that, I decided it was time to stop taking pain medication altogether. I continued to do the visualization every day since I had far better results with that method than I did with the medication. In total, it took me 3.5 months to go from a state of constant pain to being completely pain-free. I was thrilled. No medication, yet free of pain. I continued to keep my pain medication within reach, just in case. But in the end, I never used it again. I am proud to be one of those people that could be helped by Moskowitz's method. Of course, I understand that many people might be a bit skeptical of all this, but I know from my own experience that your brain can be reprogrammed to change. You may also think that all this visualization is just some sort of spiritual stuff. To put it into perspective, before my stroke, I was a down-to-earth businesswoman who was not into any kind of spiritual stuff. And while it's a relatively unknown topic now, more and more research is regularly published on mental imagery and pain. We still know so little about the human brain. If you don't believe it, Google this question. How much do scientists know about the brain? Some are of the opinion as little as 1%. Neuroplasticity wasn't even recognized by most doctors and scientists until 25 years ago, and it wasn't part of most theories regarding brain science until the functional MRI became more widely available. That's rather strange when you realize that the use it or lose it principle has been well known in science for quite a while. Moskowitz had figured out a way to unlearn pain, and I still have the brain map screensaver on my phone, just to remind me of how lucky I am. Chapter 14. Finding Realistic Hope. Quietly sitting there on the couch, I felt vulnerable as a woman approached me. I wasn't sure exactly why I felt so sensitive just then. Perhaps it was due to my less than positive memories of my speech therapist at Klimendal. "Hello, Linda," she said. "I'm Emma." She sat down next to me on the couch in the waiting room and gently touched my shoulder. Looking directly at her, I immediately noticed the sparkle in her eyes. Emma continued to talk as she got up to walk toward her treatment room. "We are going to do some speech therapy." I gave her a shy nod as I picked up my cane, trying to look nonchalant while following her down the hall. The way I walked must have looked dreadful since my hip was drooping to the left side and my hand was curled up in a tight, awkward position. Once inside the treatment room, she said, "I'm going to do some tests with you today, and at the end of the next 2 weeks, we'll retake them. That way we can see if you've made improvements." Shoot, not another test, I thought. As I sat there, remembering all the failed speech tests at Clemendal, I shrugged and responded, okay. She put the tape recorder in front of me and said, "Name as many fruits as you can within 1 minute." "Apple," I said after 10 seconds. Then I tried to figure out the name of the round, orange fruit I was picturing in my mind. It took me at least 20 seconds, although it felt more like 20 minutes. "Orange," I said. Then I thought about a banana, but I remembered that there was a debate over whether a banana was a fruit or a berry. Bananas met the botanical requirements to be a true berry, but in the culinary world, it was still considered a fruit. "Time's up," Emma said. Shoot. I was disappointed in myself, believing that my perfectionism had stood in the way of scoring the best result. Why was I thinking about a banana being a berry instead of just shouting out "banana"? I felt like I didn't pass. After Emma had given me a few more tests, she said, "Look, there is a lot of improvement that you can make. You're at how many months post-stroke now? 7 or 8? I nodded in response. "You still have the rest of your life to improve your speech, and if you practice every day, you'll hardly notice that you once had a speaking problem in something like 5 to 10 years. I almost fell out of my chair. I had recently found out about neuroplasticity, but I wasn't sure if it could apply to my speech too. This was the first time I heard a therapist say that, and I got tears in my eyes. Emma was putting the tape recorder back in her bag so she didn't see my tears. I quickly slapped myself on both cheeks. It was a habit I began as a child to stop myself from complaining or crying. It worked immediately. My tears stopped and I dried my eyes. I was smiling when she looked at me again. I got along well with Emma. I could have listened for hours to her talking about her travels to Cuba, Kenya, Gambia, Vietnam, and many other places. Although I had done some traveling to a variety of countries in my modeling days, I had not been anywhere she mentioned. I felt inspired to make a bucket list of new places to visit in the future. During our sessions, I made some small improvements in my Swedish. Each word still took a significant amount of time and effort, even though I could envision those words perfectly in my head. People who didn't know me might have thought I was stupid if they just casually observed me. I was having a difficult time speaking, so who would blame them? The truth is, my thoughts were still processing relatively quickly. I understood everything people told me, and I almost always had a reply sorted out in my head. The truth is, my thoughts were still processing relatively quickly. I understood everything people told me, and I almost always had a reply sorted out in my head. However, it took additional time to process the words and then say them out loud. I no longer had a rapid, semi-automatic way of pronouncing words. I also knew there were quite a lot of words I hadn't been able to remember yet. So, let's say I wanted to process a self-issued command 6 months after my stroke. For example, I will significantly recover my speech in 5 years. My brain would then follow these steps. Number 1, Which language did I want to speak? English? Check. Number 2. Were all the necessary words available? No. First, I had to figure out the English for sprach. After a while, I was able to find the right word, speech. Number 3. Did I know how to pronounce all the words? No, something like significantly was still too difficult. Since I couldn't pronounce it, I would replace it with a lot. Number 4. I needed to solve the issue of a Spanish word like cinco coming to mind instead of the English translation I wanted. So, how do I translate cinco? It's 5. And number 5. I was finally able to pronounce the sentence, I will recover my speech a lot more in 5 years. No wonder talking went so slowly. Numbers came to me in German or Spanish just after my stroke. Later in the book, there will be further details on the topic of aphasia and why I was having these kinds of issues. It had been a long journey so far, from not speaking at all to being able to make some sounds that were understood by others. For the first 2 months after my stroke, I couldn't speak at all. After 6 months, the left part of my tongue was still partially paralyzed. I was usually exhausted after my sessions with Emma, but she gave me one thing that I needed most at that time, a realistic sense of hope. I thought about hope for a while. What is hope, anyway? I looked it up on Google. Hope is the belief that the future will be better than the present. I figured that I should formulate my goals based on hope, so I made it my goal to be able to speak normally again. Next, I deconstructed the words Emma had said, because I realized those words were utterly important to me. Emma said that if I practiced every day, this would give me a sort of agency, the power to achieve my goal. Her words, 5 to 10 years, was a realistic time frame, and that I would hardly notice my previous speech problems told me that some people would notice and some wouldn't. Thanks, Emma. You gave me realistic hope. My mind wandered off to the conversation I had with a young doctor in the hospital after my stroke. I left in the middle of her explanation. She gave me a rundown on my status in a way that had probably been taught to her in med school. I can only wonder at how they instruct students to give the bad news lecture to a patient. Imagine the checklist in the textbook. Do not forget to specify the medical condition to the patient. Never provide the patient with false hope. Give the patient a realistic assessment of your findings. Don't speculate on the future. That type of training was probably what made her say, I doubt Linda will be able to walk and talk again. Unfortunately, that was a typical anti-hope message. Hopelessness is a state of mind in which the future is expected to be worse than the present. Her message was good for exactly one thing, causing hopelessness. Since a patient with a brain injury starts at the bottom of the ladder, at least some recovery is to be expected. She should have instead said something like this: You have severe brain trauma. I cannot make any promises about your recovery, but I can tell you that the brain will recover at least a little bit over the next few months. After that, it is all about neuroplasticity. Your brain can relearn more than you think. Relearning is all about training and repetition, for which an enormous amount of willpower is going to help. To maximize results, ensure that you train consistently, get sufficient sleep, eat healthy food, and avoid stress. Then you can surprise all of us with your recovery. We now know that all of those factors play an essential role in how well a patient recovers. So think about it. I'm speaking to you, doctors. Realistic hope is important. When Daphne, my Clemendal speech therapist, told me, "Your recovery will last for 3 to 6 months. After this period, hardly any recovery will take place," it put an enormous amount of pressure on me. I am convinced that she was not at all aware of two critical factors: my perfectionism and my tendency to be a workaholic. She did not realize that she switched on a ticking time bomb by putting a time limit on my recovery. I believe that she probably didn't have any intention of causing that level of anxiety in me, so I can forgive her. But the truth is, any therapist can easily learn to give realistic hope to a patient. They could have told me, for example, "Linda, you now have a speaking disability caused by the damage in your brain. I cannot promise you anything, but if you work hard enough, you will make improvements for years to come. However, exactly how much you are going to recover is still difficult to determine." I wondered how many other patients had seen and been impacted by the young doctor with her bad news lecture and way of dispensing information. How many patients had fully trusted so-called professionals like Daphne, causing them to accept unnecessary limitations. No statistics are kept on these issues. Certainly, adding an extra chapter to medical school textbooks about instilling hope in patients and urging them to move forward with optimism would increase the motivation of many who find themselves in a situation similar to mine. The positive conversation with Emma sparked my motivation to succeed. I knew that I had to reformulate my goals straight away. I also needed to make a realistic plan for how to achieve those goals, which were 1. Regain normal speech, 2. Regain the ability to walk normally, and 3. Regain full control over my hand. At that moment, I wasn't sure how I would do it, but I knew I was going to figure it out. Sitting in the airplane on my way home to Germany, I felt motivated. I knew that my future was going to be a lot better than my current situation. Chapter 15. Madeline. I watched her comb her hair as she stood in front of the big mirror in our living room. It was 7:35 a.m. I smiled at her, but she didn't seem to notice. She was busy doing her own thing, thinking her own thoughts, when she suddenly raced up the stairs as if hunted by a wild animal. "Papa, wake up," she exclaimed. "We need to leave in 15 minutes. Running back down the stairs with her bathing suit and towel in her left hand, Madeline put them in the backpack she used for her swimwear. Thursday was swim day at school, and she moved quickly, wasting no time. It reminded me of how, before my stroke, I would routinely multitask. Rushing to the fridge, Madeline took ham and 4 slices of bread and moved to the kitchen counter to make 2 sandwiches. She began eating one sandwich while putting the other in a red lunchbox. When Remco came downstairs, I noticed that his face looked tired. He came closer and kissed me briefly and gently on the cheek. Suddenly, Madeline commanded, "We have to go in 1 minute." She kissed me goodbye, and off they went. I was speechless. Why hadn't I noticed when she started doing for herself all the things I used to do for her? She may have only been 7 years old, but she had grown up so much in the past months. Tears were rolling down my cheeks as I blamed myself for not spending enough time with her. I was so busy with my recovery that I hadn't been available for enough time with my child. Let's change that, I thought. We can spend more time together and play games like memory. I can put her to bed every night, rubbing her back until she falls asleep. I knew she needed some quality time with her mother after the events of the past few months. When I developed severe pains about 3 months after my stroke, Madeline would massage my back. I could see that she felt good about being able to help. She had always been a giver, not a taker. She was also good at sports and excelled academically. I grew more proud of her each day. Madeline had been born right in the middle of the 2008 global financial crisis. My company was severely impacted as the crisis spun out of control 9 months before she was born. After I had to lay off 6 people while pregnant, I felt I couldn't afford to stay home when I could no longer delegate all the tasks needing to be done. On the day I gave birth to Madeline, I was still working in the office. She only weighed 2,510 grams, or 88.5 ounces, or 5 pounds and 8 ounces, depending on how you measure things. Just enough to keep her out of an incubator. In spite of the strain I was under during the pregnancy, she was a healthy baby who gained weight in no time. While searching online about fetal stress, I found an article in The Guardian that gave the results of a study on the children of mothers who experienced unusually high amounts of stress during pregnancy. In most cases, the IQ of those children was 10 points below average. Luckily, our daughter was turning out to be a smart cookie. Her teachers even told us several times, if you wanted her to, she could skip a year. We declined since we thought it was better for her to stay with the friends she already made in her class. Age-appropriate social development is necessary too. There was one thing about Madeline that worried me a bit though. She was a perfectionist and showed signs of OCD-like behavior. But hey, so did I. She went through a phase of hating any seams in her clothes, and I remember the challenge of looking for seamless clothing all over the web. Happily, her OCD signs have reduced significantly over the years. She now plays the piano, plays soccer 3 times a week, participates in street dance classes, and plays golf once a week. 2 months after my stroke, she turned 7. I remember that we celebrated her birthday on the top floor of the clinic at Ronald McDonald House. She was so happy about it being her birthday. Jerome, my friend, and fellow patient with a brain injury, helped me carry her present to the Ronald McDonald House. Her gift was a child-sized version of a Segway on which she could stand and roll around. There was plenty of space at the Ronald McDonald House, including a dedicated game room with the typical Dutch schoolbak. The game Scholen dates back to the 1500s, when English gentlemen played it. Madeline always got quite upset when she lost any game, and to be frank, at that point, she always beat me at memory. I used to tell her, you can only win or learn. But since Remco and I never liked losing when we were children either, I guess she came by her temperament naturally. The Ronald McDonald House also had a kitchen and dining table available for us to use. Remco's mother had prepared a meal for us, and we were glad to accept her help. Remco picked up the food that day, and we warmed it in the microwave. By eating our dinner together at the table, we tried to establish a bit of family time that evening. I still occasionally needed Remco, Martin, or Elle to help me shower and fall asleep, so there was not always someone to put Madeline to bed every evening. She never complained though. It wasn't in her nature. She didn't even complain when it was suddenly necessary, at only 4 years old, to have an hour-long scan in a scary machine that made loud, scary noises. An MRI. The events leading up to that MRI are noteworthy because they probably triggered my first set of physical problems. Madeline had a soft hump of fluid under the skin on top of her head. It had been there since she was a small child. The hump appeared after a fall, and we went to the hospital the day it happened. Although they sent us home the following day, the amount of swelling on the hump changed daily. At 4 years old, Madeline never seemed to notice it, but we always brought it up at the yearly visit to the children's doctor in Germany. Whenever he looked at it, he usually concluded, "The closing of the fontanelle can take time, and it is not unheard of that the fontanelle only starts to close at the age of..." During a rare visit to my Dutch GP, I asked her to take a look at Madeline's hump as well. Since Madeline was only 5 at the time, the GP suggested that we go to Slingelen Hospital for a scan. An appointment was made, and Madeline had a CT scan of her head a few weeks later. We were told that it would take some time to process the image and that our doctor would contact us later with the findings. 2 weeks later, on a Friday afternoon, I received a call from the doctor at Slingelen Hospital. She explicitly asked if we could come to the hospital that same day. She mentioned that it was no problem if we couldn't make it until 5. The doctor also said nothing that took away our concerns when she declined to tell us anything about the results over the phone. The sound of urgency in her voice made us nervous, and we drove to the hospital in absolute silence. A blonde-haired woman came into the waiting room, introduced herself as Madeline's doctor, and asked us to follow her to the office. After getting us settled into the chairs in front of her desk, she sat down behind it and began. "As we know, Madeline had a small skull fracture from the fall when she was 5 months old. There is only ever a 1 in 1,500 chance for an infant who suffered a linear skull fracture to develop a growing skull fracture. A growing skull fracture is caused when the fast-growing skull grows apart at that linear fracture because the meninges, membranes that envelop the brain and spinal cord, prevent the two sides from growing back together." As I listened, my mother instinct to calm down took over, and I did not initially allow myself to cry. But as the doctor turned her monitor in our direction to show us the picture of Madeline's skull, I burst into tears when I saw the photographic rendering of the CT scan. It indicated what was quite clearly the top of Madeline's skull. We saw it plain as day, the enormous gaping hole in her head, as round and large as an extra eye socket. The doctor gave us a compassionate look, saying, "Madeline will need to be examined further. Since we have no specialized child neurologists here, we'll send her to the Radboud University Medical Center in Nijmegen, where they do have specialized doctors. A growing skull fracture is a very rare condition, and I've personally never come across one in my career. I had to do some research, but there is no reason to assume that Madeline's situation requires immediate attention, since she's been doing fine with the fracture for years. An operation may be necessary." My emotions finally got the best of me. My youngest child had a gaping hole in her skull, and I felt frantic. "What's going to happen next?" I asked. "It's hard to say since I'm no expert, and of course it's going to depend on further research. An operation to close the hole will be needed sooner rather than later. The operation in question is, of course, not without risks, since the brain is right there in that same area. There will always be a risk of brain damage." That was how we started our weekend. When we got home, I began an internet search on growing skull fractures that lasted all night long. As the doctor told us, the condition was pretty rare. But being the control freak that I am, I wanted answers, and waiting was not an option. I could feel the stress starting to build up inside of me. Somehow, Remco always stayed quite a bit calmer than I ever could, sometimes to the point that it almost seemed like he didn't care. Of course, I knew that he did care, genuinely, but how could he stay so calm? Over the next few days, I contacted several doctors. One doctor in Dusseldorf even told us she could perform surgery on Madeline the following day. Then I called my brothers in Sweden. They showed Madeline's brain image to a fellow doctor, a brain surgeon. He told us not to operate just yet. We decided to listen to the Swedish doctor and waited 12 long days until our appointment in Nijmegen for Madeline to get her MRI scan in order to see if immediate surgery was really necessary. That Wednesday, our poor little 4-year-old child had to be in the MRI scanner for nearly an hour. In the scanner, you have to lie completely still in a tunnel-like machine while thumping, pulsing, and vibrating noise is all around you. For a child, that must have been frightening. Madeline said she understood the procedure completely when it was described to her, and she did what had to be done. A week later, we met Dr. Van Linder, a very friendly and understanding child neurologist at Radboud. He explained his findings from the MRI, telling us that Madeline was the only documented case he could find where the skull fracture seemed to have almost completely closed again on its own. He couldn't believe his eyes as he went through the different layers that the MRI scanner had mapped. Only a small hole was left, allowing the cerebrospinal fluid to create the swelling outside the skull. He had good hopes that the gap would close by itself in the coming years, and his suggestion was not to perform any surgery at all. He explained that there were more risks involved in the operation itself than doing nothing. Then he suggested that we make another appointment in 2 or 3 years. There was one warning though. The doctor told us that we should be extra aware of an increased risk of meningitis if Madeline were ever to injure her head. We emailed the MRI scan to another doctor in Berlin and asked him for a second opinion on Dr. Van Linder's findings. That doctor must have been a very kind and warm-hearted person because he replied that same Sunday. He wrote that he completely agreed with the findings of Dr. Van Linder and wished us a pleasant weekend. I could finally escape my stress, that sensation of being in survival mode. Now that my mind was at least somewhat put at ease, I could relax again. We went out for dinner to celebrate the fact that Madeline did not have to undergo surgery. The tension had begun to leave my body, but I noticed that I was starting to feel a bit weird. The following day, I went out for a 20-kilometer run. When I came home, I had to sit down because I started feeling sensations like needles in my legs and ants crawling on my arms. I figured it would disappear overnight, but it didn't. I kept working as usual, but I could feel my body protesting. A month passed. Instead of disappearing, my symptoms became more worrisome. I decided to go for a medical checkup, but the doctor couldn't find anything concrete to explain what was happening to me. When my symptoms gradually worsened, I returned to my doctor who decided to refer me to a neurologist. The neurologist told me in a very straightforward manner, "It looks like you're experiencing the symptoms of burnout." "Burnout?" I said. "I don't believe it." I walked out of the room. And so, I went straight back to work. Back then, I thought burnout was for losers. In hindsight, that was the wrong way of thinking about what the doctor had been trying to tell me. But instead of listening to that advice, I turned to the internet and started Googling my list of symptoms. I could hardly sleep at that point. Lyme disease made more sense to me, and a lot of the symptoms matched. I had taken some antibiotics for a tick bite 2 years earlier, when a red ring appeared on the back of my knee. The internet stories on chronic Lyme disease were pretty scary, and I read that 2 weeks of antibiotics could allow the Lyme to survive and cause neurological damage when the body was weakened. That's it, I thought. As I went to revisit the doctor, I realized that I had seen more doctors in those 3 months of searching for answers than I had in the 40 years prior. Based on the information I gathered on borreliosis, which causes Lyme and can stay undetected in your body. I advised the doctor to prescribe me more antibiotics. She didn't give them to me though. Instead, she prescribed oxazepam so I could fall asleep again. The symptoms had gotten so bad that I was admitted to the hospital twice during our vacation in Sweden, once in Gothenburg and once in Stockholm. The cause of my symptoms remained frustratingly unknown. My sleeplessness peaked as well, since I was trying to get off the oxazepam, a drug that can have side effects like sleeplessness and anxiety when you stop taking it. I ended up going to a specialized Lyme doctor in Germany. She started treating me based on all the symptoms I had and gave me 3.5 months supply of antibiotics. I was also instructed to take 2 months off from work. After carefully following the prescribed routine, my neurological symptoms disappeared. At the time, I was unsure of what had initially caused those issues, but I was relieved and happy that they were finally resolved. Looking back now, I believe I did have burnout due to stress. Since so much time has passed, no one can ever be sure. The many effects of stress on your central nervous system and how you can get rid of stress will be explained in a later chapter. Through it all, Madeline helps me to remember to put things into perspective with her childlike spirit of acceptance and her supply of jokes, and lots of love.